Welcome to Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. We concluded the last program with Sir Henry discussing the inscription of historic Bridgetown and its garrison as a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
And that leads me to the invitation that I had from the Cabinet to chair a preservation task force. And that was now quite a few years ago. I had retired. I had promised to give the National Trust 5 years of my time, of my life, after retirement, working on preservation, working on what we call the Sentinel and Plaques Committee, identifying historic buildings, working to expand the Broadhagen list and to correct it and to make recommendations to government for its addition or for defaulting. And basically to work with the Trust in restoring again Tyrrell Court 20 years after it had kind of been restored the first time. I promised to do all of that. And so I took on this chore of chairing the Preservation Task Force with a wonderful group of people. Paul Simpson, the architect, Carl Watson, the historian, Dr. Marcia Burrows, another historian, Paul Altman, the realtor, other people involved in culture, architecture, business, and so on. We had a magnificent committee called the Task Force, and we met at the Ministry of Culture. And we saw the list of things that government hoped that we would raise many millions of dollars. Now, I'd raised $1 million to restore Colleton College, and with the help of Margaret Dowding, well, Jill Shepherd worked with me on that. Margaret Dowding worked with me on Tyrrell Court's $1 million that we raised. So Mr. Stewart, the Prime Minister, probably thought, well, if Henry Fraser can raise $1 million here and $1 million there 20 years ago, then surely he can raise $20 million to restore all the buildings that we've ignored. We prioritized the Carnegie Library, which had been abandoned in 2006, 10 years before, because of no maintenance. We prioritized that because a library is essential for the culture of a country. New libraries are being built all over the world. They have the old stacks with the old books, they have the new books as they come out, and they have information centers. They have carousels with computers, and they have staff who are expert at doing searches. So if you want to go into the library and you want to find out the history of Tyrrell Court, and you can't get through to Henry Fraser on the phone because there's so many other calls asking him about it, you can go to the carousel and you can get someone to help you, to show you how to do a search of what is on the web. And that's happening all over the world. But no, we've abandoned our Carnegie Library. We have dishonored the bequest that gave us the money to build that library on condition that it would be a free library for the entire population of Barbados. And every one of my generation and over has studied in that library on Saturday mornings and at end of school in the afternoons. All the older generation, some of them gave us small sums of money, modest sums of money, $100, $1,000 towards it. You know, those $1,000 and $100 gifts have still not had any action because the Ministry of Culture basically fell apart. Nothing would work. Individuals and companies would tell us, we're not going to restore the library, the government will just let it fall down again. And others said, we don't trust the government. And we had a major problem. I'm not going to go into the details, but things just didn't work out. We had a wonderful executive officer funded by the Christopher Holder Foundation. But although they were initially enthusiastic, something went wrong, and Mr. Holder said no. So the Carnegie Library is still there, waiting, 10 years later. That's really a great pity.
Yes, a great pity indeed. Perhaps this presents an opportunity for Barbadians to write, publish, and discuss their ideas for the restoration and repurposing of this forgotten treasure. Now, Sir Henry continues the program with his perspective on Barbados's connection to North America and the Carolinas.
Barbadians have been emigrating to North America literally forever. People came here thinking that Barbados was a big place. They discovered all the land was gone, so they moved on to North America. The Jewish community, eventually, after emancipation, they saw the economy going down, which it did, and many of them emigrated soon after they had rebuilt the Jewish synagogue in 1833. Barbados had also been responsible for founding colonies. It started with what is now Suriname. It was established as Willoughby Land by the governor, Lord Willoughby, but then it was ceded eventually to the Dutch, and it became the Dutch colony of Suriname. Barbados had captured Tobago. In fact, it captured it twice. And I always say that the Barbadian ships going down to capture Tobago and settling Tobago briefly for a while had taken our flying fish into what is called Barbados Bay. The entire scallop or curve of the southeastern part of the little island of Tobago, all of that is called Barbados Bay, and that is where our flying fish swim and frolic and have their being. So when the Trinidadians venture out into Barbados Bay and catch flying fish, which they have not learned how to cook, although the Trinis are great cooks, and I love having a Creole meal in Trinidad at one of their Creole restaurants, they cannot cook flying fish. They don't know what to do with it, basically. And that colony did not hold. It eventually became a kind of potpourri of different nations, all trading with each other in Little Scarborough. It was fascinating. But we departed, we left it to the Trinidadians. And the Carolinas are the place where we really succeeded. What happened is that Sir John Colleton bought land unseen in Barbados, first what is called Colleton in St. Lucie, and then what was called Colleton in St. John. And he then came out here, and he was a prolific, healthy man, and he had a number of children. And in the 1660s, the early 1660s, he realized there wasn't enough land, there wasn't enough for his children to do. What was he going to do with all these 4 sons? Because in the old days in Britain, you see, they had a thing called the law of primogeniture. And if you, Sherwood, were a wealthy landowner in Britain with 2,000 acres of land and a great mansion, and you had 4 sons, well, your eldest son would have inherited the property entirely. That was it. You could have left a chest or a ring or something to the others, but the eldest son got it all. The second son was forced to go into the army, and the third son to become a priest. Or it may have been the other way around. If the second son was clearly not fit to be a soldier, he might have become the priest, and the third son into the army. What did son number 4 do? He had to become an adventurer. So for 100 or 200 years, that 4th son, he went out looking for opportunities. He became an adventurer. And those people came to the Caribbean. Sometimes they sold their lives as bondservants, thinking that they would get land at the end, and they were deceived by the deceitful landowners, and they made a mess of their lives. Others simply went, some of them became buccaneers. Some of them went with a little bit of money from the brother who'd got all the land. Some of them went with some money and bought a piece of land and might have done well and become a plantocrat in Barbados or Jamaica. But basically, Sir John Colleton had these 4 sons, and he promoted what was the adventurers. These people were literally adventurers, exploring what was known as Carolina. Carolina is the Latin name for Charles, and the Carolinas are in that part of southeastern United States of America now, which were called the Carolina after King Charles I. And by the 1660s, nothing had been done by the British about settling it. The Spaniards had taken hold of all that is Florida and going up the coast of southern Carolina a little bit, just a little bit. It was mostly the peninsula and the panhandle of Florida. The French had taken Louisiana, and that whole area between Virginia in the north, where the English had settled in 1620 or thereabouts, and down in Florida, that was empty except for the indigenous people. So the colonials of Europe, they all felt they had a right to take over these lands because they had the guns and the power and the know-how, and they took over these lands. But the Carolinas, for some reason, the adventurers explored, nothing much happened. Another group went off and explored. And eventually in 1663, Sir John Colleton wrote to a friend of his who became Lord Ashley in Britain, and who was a very close, intimate friend of King Charles II, who had returned to the throne. And he said, we would like to settle Carolina. And permission was given. So the philosopher John Locke, he drew up a governance proposal and an agreement on the real estate of the Carolinas and decided that the whole thing would become English, and a group of 8 high up wealthy people would be given vast tracts of land. I think the sum was 96,000 acres each for them to do what they liked with. And he wrote down the governance of what would be the Carolinas, and the funding was secured for what I call the Odyssey. And the Odyssey comprised 3 ships fitted out with sailors and servants from England and Ireland, and they left Ireland, crossed the Atlantic, and ended up in Barbados. They lost 1 ship in a storm on the way. That ship was replaced in Barbados, and papers from Britain giving Sir John Yeamans, the man reputed to have killed his partner at Nicholas in order to marry his wife. Sir John Yeamans was a powerful man. I call him the J.R. of the 17th century, after the unscrupulous J.R. of the famous TV series Dallas that ran for so long. Sir John Yeamans was obviously a wicked man. He was given the governorship of the Carolinas, and he got onto one of these ships at Speightstown, which was known as Little Bristol in those days, and he went off with the Odyssey on these 3 ships. One of the ships, not the one with him, got wrecked in a storm. They got to Bermuda, and he decided to come home. He had just married his friend's wife, and he must have considered her too seductive and a danger to be left at home alone by herself for some other guy to take over. So he handed the governor papers to an elderly 80-year-old man in Bermuda and said, "You'll be the governor." And he came back to Barbados. The ships, 2 of the ships eventually found their way to Charleston, and they settled at what was the first site in the Carolinas called Charlestown. And they built up a little town there, and eventually, after a couple of years, they said, "That's too swampy. This is not a good site." They went to another site called Oyster Point, and they built up a town there. And the town that they built up there was laid out by a Barbadian. It was laid out by a man called John Culpeper. He was an early town planner, and he laid out the town within walls, with all of the streets set out like in a ladder, and on all of the streets, all of the house sites were divided up, and there were long, narrow sites. And he must have been friendly with Ligon, or heard all about Ligon and the single house, because he designed those sites that they would all have on them a single room wide house and a driveway past the house. And all of those houses were called single houses after the term used in Ligon's book in Barbados. And that historic center of Charlestown, now called Charleston, laid out by a Barbadian who would have been familiar with Ligon's book. Single houses all the way down the street, every street, single houses, 20 or so feet wide, and tall and narrow, just like Arlington in Barbados. And so the Charleston setting, as a very early settlement, became the center of life and high society in southeastern USA. What the Barbadians did in Charleston, of course, was not just to take their house design and a bit of their language, because people in the islands and on the coast speak a lot like Bajans. They speak the language, the dialect that is called Gullah, but they took slavery, of course, and they took the slave code of slavery, and they took sugar. So they took the sugar and slaves, thinking that on these vast tracts of land they would grow vast quantities of sugar. But it was much too swampy in the area, much too wet, and they discovered rice grew much better. And people from Africa actually knew something about rice growing. And others came in and they established rice plantations, and they grew very wealthy on rice and other crops as opposed to sugar. So it did not become a great sugar plantation. The plantations that grew sugar developed later inland, but it became very powerful and it became very rich. And what is relevant is 2 amazing sites in Charleston, which we were taken to Charleston to visit. One of them is a place called Drayton Hall, and Drayton Hall is the magnificent Palladian-style mansion on 3 stories that was built around 1740 by the grandson of a man called Thomas Drayton. and it is an icon of Palladian style architecture translated into America in the early 18th century. An amazing house. And the family of Draytons lived there through 8 generations. And the last member of the Drayton family died in that house around 1960. And there was no running water and there was no electric light in that mansion, because this old lady said, I don't want anything modern. I respect this house and I'm living in it the way my ancestors did. Now, when I went to Charleston with Warren Alleyne, it was as a result of our TV series Treasures of Barbados and as a result of our advocate articles. Warren and I had written those articles, and Warren was a friend of Markley Wilson, who was running our tourist board in New York. And Marcus Wilson went down to the Spoleto Festival in Charleston. And the Spoleto Festival was a big festival like our Crossover, but one of the things he discovered about Charleston was the connection and the fact that Barbadians had settled Charleston. As a historian there called George Rogers said, Barbados was the mother colony of the colony of Charleston. So I mentioned Willoughby Land, Suriname, I mentioned Tobago, but Charleston was the one that really succeeded, the Carolinas. And when the Barbadians went there, they named the parishes after the parishes of Barbados. So we have St. Michael and St. Peter and St. George, just like in Barbados. And the churches were given the names of the churches in Barbados and built like them, just as the houses were. So Wilson went down, saw it, and he said, we've got to explore this further. And he contacted Margaret Hope, the information officer at the Tourist Board, and Sir Jack Dare, the chairman, and they said, we'll send Warren Alleyne and Henry Fraser up there. Warren on the history, Alleyne, Henry on the houses and the architecture. And we spent 10 days up there with members of the Tourist Board, and he came down from New York, and we went out to these places, Drayton Hall and Middleton Place, developed by people who had been in Barbados. They were not Barbadian born, but they had been to Barbados, lived in Barbados, had property in Barbados, moved off to Charleston and created these 2 amazing sites. When we left Drayton Hall in this big taxi car, we drove out of the gate posts of Drayton Hall. And as we were leaving the property, a gentleman security came out to speak with us, and within a few minutes of speaking, we told him we were from Barbados, and his eyes lit up. And he said, I'm from Barbados too. He said, I'm an 8th generation Barbados. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather came to Carolina as a slave with Mr. Drayton. And we have lived and worked on this property ever since. And I'm the last member of my family working on this property. And I am proud and pleased to be here, and I wish I could go back to Barbados, my mother country. This was what he said. And so we came home to Barbados, and we moved Jack Dare and the Tourist Board that we should bring Mr. Drayton down to Barbados. And he came to Barbados, paid for by the Tourist Board, and when he was met on the tarmac by the members of the Tourist Board, he came down the steps and he knelt down, a man of 70 or so, and he knelt down and he kissed the ground. And he said, I've dreamt all my life that I would come back home. And you know that in Barbados, that the Brooms and the Bowens all come from St. Lucie. All the names beginning with B except the Bowens. But the Brooms and the Bowens are all St. Lucie people. And he said that he knew by oral history that his family had come from St. Lucie. So members of the Tourist Board took Richmond down to St. Lucie, where they knew families of Bowens living in one of the villages or 2. And they claimed that they looked at Mr. Bowen and they looked at the Bowens in the villages and they said, but you all are obviously family. Now, this was a bit far-fetched, 8 generations down, because the genes had been diluted a great deal. But it was a very lovely story about Mr. Bowen. And The Charleston Barbados connection is an important one because every now and again someone gets excited about it. The most excited person about it is Rhoda Green. Because when we came home, Sir Jack Dare said, "You all have enough information, and this is important enough to Barbados. You should write a book about it." Well, it was very easy for Warren to write the first 2 or 3 chapters on the history, and it was very easy for me to write the next 3 chapters on the single house, Middleton Place, and Drayton Hall. And I had met people speaking Gullah. So I was excited about Gullah, and I talked to Jeanette Lane Clark about it, and I wrote this chapter on the Gullah dialect. And I've subsequently met my namesake, Herb Fraser, who comes from the islands off the coast. He's a great man. He's a media man and is the marketing man at Magnolia Gardens, which is another Drayton property. And Rhoda Green read our book when it came out, The Barbados Carolina Connection, produced first by Macmillan. And she moved down to Charleston. And this is a wonderful story. I have to talk a little about Rhoda Green because Rhoda is one of 3 sisters whose family emigrated to New York. And they lived somewhere in the Harlem district. And they went to a church where they met a family of Jamaicans who'd emigrated to New York. And this Jamaican family had twin sons, one of whom was a doctor and one an anthropologist. And Rhoda and her 2 sisters, they all went to the same church, and they met and became extremely friendly. And Rhoda married a Barbadian called Robert, and her 2 sisters married these twin brothers from Jamaica. And one day when their children were getting big, they thought to themselves, where we're living is too close to the crime in Harlem. It's not exactly in Harlem, but it's not really a nice place. It's not close enough to country and parks. Too much crime in New York. It was long before the recent almost elimination of crime by the current mayor. And they said, let's find a better place to live. And they went down to Charleston. And they ended up moving to Charleston, 3 generations, 2 couples of parents, 3 couples in the next generation, and all their children, 6 and 6, 12 and 2, 14 people, all moved to Charleston, found property in Charleston and lived there. And Rhoda came to work with the mayor of Charleston. And she discovered my book, The Barbados Carolina Connection, and she became passionate about it. So she became our honorary consul in Charleston, has promoted our book, and she is now the agent for the Barbados Carolina Connection new edition produced by Miller Publishing. And it's really a multi-action thing because they have what they call the Heritage Corridor in the Carolinas, and Rhoda is part of that, and she produced the Barbados Carolina Foundation, which she is the president of, promoting the connection. And it's a major connection because every month or so somebody that I meet at the beach or in town or calls me up and says, "Wow, I've been to Charleston. I got your book and I've been to Charleston. How amazing." So what we would like, those of us involved in tourism, in heritage tourism and so on, we would love to see a direct flight between here and Charleston. The problem is that Charleston is a city of only a couple of million people, or a bit over 1 million people. It's Charleston and its suburbs. It's not a big city. And I don't know how hard the tourist board or the Minister of Tourism has tried to make that connection. But we've talked about it an awful lot. And we won't really open that corridor, that interesting place, until we have a flight that makes it easier to get to Charleston. Because you leave Barbados on the early flight and you hang over in Miami for hours, and then you finally get to Charleston late at night. It's not the best way of forging a brotherhood for what was our former colony. A word about the slave thing, because obviously the Bajans of old took their slaves with them, and they took the slave culture and the slave society which had been developed in the early colony of Barbados. And so it's a bit of a sore point in a sense that the Bajans not only took their language and their architecture and their people, and in the old days when they had telephone directories, you looked down the Charleston telephone directory and you thought you were in Barbados. Because literally, the names were unbelievable. The names were Brathwaite and Adams and Grosvenor and Critchlow, Clark and Jones. and Simpson, and all the Bajan names were there, you know, because it was, all these people were introverted. They were a long way from other places. So they literally populated the city with Barbadian descendants. And Middleton Place is a very sensible historic site, because what they've done in one of their cabins, and the cabins which they call cabins for the slaves who worked on their plantation, were very much bigger than the little stone slave huts that we had in Barbados at the time of abolition. And they had considerable cabins with rooms the size of this porch, and they have one of them in which they have documented on all of the walls the entire history of slavery on their plantation. And what they have been doing is identifying the descendants of slaves from Middleton Place. And they have reunions of descendants from slaves of a couple of hundred people whom they put up in all the surrounding hotels every year. So that it's really fascinating. They have the Middleton Place family. And these descendants are proud and pleased to come back every year. And in the Barbados Carolina Connection book, they had started doing this several years before we put that book together and got Miller to publish it. There's a wonderful picture of more than 200 people standing together at Middleton Place on one of the Middleton Place reunions. And I think that's a nice way of acknowledging the history and recognizing it and seeing, well, hey, you know, we came through that. And here we are as healthy, some wealthy people whose ancestors went through that tough time.
Equally so, it is an important way of recognizing that special connection, that bond that exists between Barbados and the Carolinas. This has been Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. The series continues next week at the same time.